What's up, party people? My name's Chris, and I'm a bookaholic. Welcome back. Hey, look, I want to talk about. It's a weird one, but whatever. What I want to talk about today is how authors, whom I love, influence me to explore other authors based on their love for those other authors. Does that make sense? So, authors that authors love, I'm interested in those books if I love that author. What? Authors that authors love, I'm interested in if I love those authors. What? Whoa, dude. All right. Let's explain. I'll explain. Okay, so here's the author. Let's say this is my patient zero here. When it comes to an author that I met, I wish I would have met, but I met, literally speaking, I met, his name is Pat Conroy, The Great Santini. This is the first book I ever read by Pat Conroy, and honestly, memories for me are really kind of important, and I have good memories of spending time with my grandmother who was reading some of his books, Pat Conroy's books. I remember watching the movie for The Prince of Tides with Barbara Streisand and Nick Nolte, and I think I liked a lot of that, but then I was irritated with some of the marital discord and some of the struggles with stuff like that. And so I kind of had not a bad taste in my mouth, but I just wasn't infatuated with the whole kind of dynamic of that story, plot, and I was probably hesitant to then dive into him as an author I'd want to regularly read. So, I had positive and I had maybe not so positive introductions to him, having never read his stuff. Well, I started by reading The Great Santini, and I was wrecked during this book at times, and blown away and frustrated and in awe of Pat Conroy's writing. After I finished this book, which to me resonated on a million levels. Now, I have an amazing father, but, as any kid can attest to, you struggle at times with your parents in varying degrees. And my parents had gotten a divorce when I was young, and I always wanted him to be around. And there just was that typical kind of scenario of being a kid who, missed his parents in a regular parental way, but they did so much good for me. But that ache of a son with the father, while exceptionally and extremely different, there was something about that ache and that longing to please a father, to be with a father, to have, his influence and impact. There was something about that was resonating with me, while the story was completely unrelatable in some ways. Like, he grows up on a military base. His father's, a military person. I grew up with neither of those being influences in my life, and yet I just was immersed in this book, and I loved it. So Pat Conroy, immediately I thought, I can't not read his books. I'm going after it. And right after that, then I did read The Prince of Tides, and that book wrecked me in a lot of ways too. I mean, just the struggle of abuse and trauma, and the reality of its ramifications in marriage later. I mean, you don't always get all that in a movie, right? But the book, the way that Pat Conroy writes, you're introduced to this great mystery and struggle, and the main character is wanting to help his sister, and there's so much struggle and tension, and his own marriage is having all of these issues, and he's going to go to New York City to try to intervene and help his sister, who's in dire straits, and interacts with her psychologist, and this story unfolds, and you're like, there's so much family chaos here. How could you possibly have an ending that is satisfying? And it's It's so profound. My recommendation though is do not read the two back to back. That's my only. It's not a negative, but that's my only. Caveat is you don't want to read those two right away together, because you're gonna dive back into the past, and kind of this storied upbringing, this small, child. The influences and impacts. To me, I found that occasionally the story plot would I was a little bit confused. Am I still reading The Great Santini, or am I reading now, Prince of Tides? And so, I think if you don't read these two back to back, it would make for an even better experience. So I started listening to all the interviews I could find about Pat Conroy, and then unfortunately he passed away. And just the other day, it was kind of cool. I found beach music in a thrift store, and I had it already in a paperback, but this I believe is a first edition. So I'm pretty pumped about that. Eventually, hopefully, one day I could find a signed copy by him. But there's a lot about his life that I find fascinating. He's Catholic. I'm Catholic. There's some things about that really are interesting for me. His takes on his religious upbringing. And so, he's certainly a flawed individual. I'm not coming to him for my moral standard. But in terms of an author, one of my all-time favorites. Well, because I started watching all these interviews, he kept mentioning a couple of authors. And as a result, I thought, well, I should check out those authors too, And Padgett is one of them. And so Anne Padgett is known for Bel Canto, Taft, and State of Wonder. Now, I haven't read those three, but I did read or listen to her give the audio of These Precious Days. And I think what I realized is that this shouldn't have been the book I started with. I feel like if I was all in already on Anne Padgett, if I loved her stuff, then that book would have made some sense to me. These Precious Days is almost like it's not journal-esque, but it has a little tone and tenor to that. She's sharing some stuff, during the pandemic, just certain reflections, familial. It's really somewhat autobiographical. It's a witness to certain feelings and things that are in her mind. And okay, so great. And I can see if I were already all in on Anne Padgett, that would be I'd love to listen to that with Pat Conroy, because I'm already in the zone. His work has, I'm not going to say completely changed me, but was so satisfying that whenever I think of Pat Conroy's writing, I'm like, oh my gosh, I love everything he does. I want to know about. And so anyway, all that to say, I think with me, Anne Padgett, okay, great. I mean, I'm going to give her stories a go because, again, Pat Conroy loves her and spoke highly of her. The other is, and I think he would consider this an author of the Low Country, that South Carolina, is maybe, I guess if I were to say it, when it comes to this author, I probably would think of, my parents. This doesn't seem like an author for me. And yet, because Pat Conroy loves her, I will probably try her. And that's Ann Rivers Sidons, or Sidons. But Ann Rivers Sidons has a variety of books. Colony, Hill Towns, Fault Lines, Islands. There's another one, Up Island. And I think all of these are probably taking place in that similar region for, the South Carolina Low Country, that Pat Conroy was always writing in. So, just an example here. Annie Butler as a caretaker and nurturer, first for her own brothers and sisters, and then as a director of an agency devoted to the welfare of children. And what she has never had is a real family. And that changes when she meets and marries Louis Aiken, an exuberant surgeon 15 years older than Annie. And when they marry, she finds her family. Not a traditional one, but a group of Charleston childhood friends who are inseparable, who are one another's surrogate family, and they are called the Scrubs, and they all, in some way, have the common cord of family. So, again, I think at first glance, I would say, that sounds all right, but it's not really my cup of tea. I'm not necessarily interested in that, but because, Pat Conroy loves her, I would give her the benefit of the doubt and maybe try and find a new author that I wouldn't normally have gravitated towards. Another book that Pat Conroy constantly seems to praise and reference is Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel Gone with the Wind. And, as a young boy, I remember watching that on television. Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable. That movie, was in a lot of ways for many of us, kind of a big televised experience that we all enjoyed. I mean, it was recognized and seen as a classic and important novel. And for Pat Conroy, I think especially having grown up in the South and his love for literature, I think it resonated with him. I think so much so that he would even see his mother, and I don't know if Scarlett O'Hara was necessarily the figure that his mother was exactly likened to, but I think that this idea of Queen of the South, it was something that was kind of just a part of who he was, and so he spoke highly of that book. I've actually never read this book, although I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that. It is a classic, and I'm old enough where that would have been something that coulda, shoulda, woulda been required in some of my literature classes growing up, but it wasn't. And while I did read a number of books by Ernest Hemingway and was introduced to James Joyce and Dos Passos and others, I personally felt like there were certain periods in our history specifically that we were not introduced to, although I did take a number of American history literature classes. So, look, this is the funny thing is that just because Pat Conroy suggested Gone with the Wind or Ann Patchett or Ann River-Sidens, I'm going to read them, or I'm going to be at least open to reading them. And I think that's really kind of funny. What authors are like that for you? If they recommend a book, you're like, okay, I'm going to give it a go. And for many of you, I've heard a lot of this kind of banter when it comes to certain fantasy authors, that they loved another fantasy author, and all of a sudden you gravitate towards that individual. So give me some recommendations, people that you love, maybe some authors that you love and the books that they love. That would be cool. So, all right. I love this stuff, and I hope you do too.